How risky are real users' IFT applets? My name is Camille Cobb, and this paper is the outcome of a collaboration with authors from CMU, NC State, and Wellesley College. Our study focuses on the possible risks associated with smart home devices, which are becoming increasingly popular. But prior research and real-world events have repeatedly demonstrated the potential for these devices to lead to security and privacy harms. For example, you may have read news articles about smart home devices being co-opted into large-scale botnets, or maybe you've wondered about whether your smart voice assistant is eavesdropping on your conversations. It gets even worse if you consider the possible impacts of end-user programming tools, which allow users to connect devices or services that wouldn't otherwise be able to interact with each other. What new risks exist if your oven can be turned on via motion detection? The most popular end-user programming tool is called If This Then That, or IFT, and it has over 5 million installs on the Google Play Store alone. IFT users combine triggers and actions, which are provided by IFT, to create rules, or applets, that react to and control their smart home devices or other services. For example, if the multi-purpose SmartThings sensor I installed in my mailbox is closed, then blink the hue lights in my office so I know I can go get my mail. There are lots of triggers and actions which can be combined to create a ton of different rules. So it shouldn't be too surprising that some combinations of triggers and actions are potentially harmful. We build on prior work that sought to identify rules with secrecy and integrity violations. Secrecy violations occur when a rule allows information to flow from a more private source, the trigger, to a less private sink, the action, possibly leaking private information to a wider audience than intended. For example, in the rule, if SmartThings sensor is closed, then post a message to Slack, the SmartThings sensor, which might be attached to my mailbox or my front door or somewhere even more private, would leak information to people on Slack whenever it's closed, even though the people on Slack probably wouldn't be able to see it for themselves when the sensor is closed. This is a secrecy violation. An integrity violation occurs when a rule gives unauthorized people access to controlled devices or services. For example, in the rule, if motion detected in front yard, then unlock my front door, anyone who can gain access to my front yard, which is probably a lot of people, could then suddenly unlock my front door, which could compromise my home security, and is likely not intended. So considering the applets in general, how do we automatically determine which ones have secrecy or integrity violations? The first step is to label all of the triggers and actions. For secrecy, the labels describe who can know that the trigger occurred or who can know that the action occurred. And for integrity, they describe who can cause the trigger and who could cause the action without using the rule. These labels are approximations at answers to these questions. In terms of secrecy, possible labels include private, public, restricted physical, and restricted online. Private and public are relatively self-explanatory. Restricted online is used for actions and triggers that can be observed by online groups, such as all of my Facebook friends. Restricted physical is used for actions or triggers that can be observed by people in a particular physical space, such as people in or near my home who could usually see when my living room lights come on. The next step is to encode relationships between these labels. We do so by essentially turning these labels into a directed graph, which we call a lattice, where the arrows show safe directions of information flow from triggers to actions. A rule with a public trigger and a private action is safe. This is because the public trigger means there's no secret information implied by the trigger, and the private action means that the rule won't result in information being shared with anyone anyway. The existence of forward-pointing arrows from public to private conveys this relationship. On the other hand, a rule with a private trigger and a public action is violating. There's no way to get from private to public using only forward edges. It's also impossible to get from restricted online to restricted physical or vice versa. So rules with these labels are violating. Intuitively, this reflects that my Facebook friends who can see my whatever online posts I make might not normally be able to know whether the lights in my bedroom are on. And my housemates who can tell whether my lights are on might not be friends with me on Facebook. Some triggers and actions can have multiple labels. For example, an action that creates a Twitter post could be restricted online or public, depending on whether the Twitter account is public or protected. In this case, we consider all possible combinations of trigger and action labels, and if any of the flows are violating, we consider the rule violating. So even though restricted online to restricted online is safe, restricted online to public is violating. And so we would consider this combination of trigger and action labels violating. There's a bit more nuance in the original work, which was done by Surbatovich et al. In 2017, but I won't go into more detail about that in this talk. In that prior work by Surbatovich et al., the authors looked at over 19,000 applets that were available on the IFT website in 2017 and used the analysis I've just described to determine that almost 50% of applets available on IFT had potential violations. 17% had secrecy violations, 23% had integrity violations, and 10% had both. But the data from this prior work was limited. It represented all of the unique applets that had been shared on IFT or lacked important context about how they were used, which can affect the riskiness of an applet. For example, given only the trigger and action for this rule, we might wonder, where is the sensor placed, and who has access to the Slack channel? If the message is posted in a private Slack channel, there's no secrecy violation at all. If the Slack channel includes other people, and if the sensor detects when my front door has been closed, then the rule could leak information about my daily behaviors and habits, such as when I come and go from home and how often. If the sensor is placed on a rarely accessed safe where I keep important documents or my go bag, the rule might only execute on rare occasions, possibly corresponding to times when I would want other people to be alerted, maybe because something has gone wrong. To move from these more theoretical measurements of potential violations to an understanding of harms that could arise in practice, we conducted new work to understand what fraction of users' applets are violating in practice, and how much and what type of harm are IFT users actually exposed to. We recruited 28 IFT users who were active in online home automation forums, and with their consent and IRB approval, we used a browser extension to collect data about their applets. This allowed us to see user-specified titles for the applets, which often included relevant contextual details. Participants also responded to a short survey about their use of IFT and their specific applets. This applet was used by participant 28 and had the title, "If front door sensor is closed, then post a message to Slack." So we still don't know who can see the Slack message, but the title does reveal that the sensor is on the front door, which could tell us something about what risks might exist. Next, we used a slightly updated version of the automated analysis from prior work and determined that 59% of participants' rules had violations, 11% had secrecy violations, 22% had integrity, and 26% had both. This is relatively similar to the prior results, but so far we haven't made use of context. So the next step was to use the context available in the applet titles and the result of our survey responses to evaluate whether the analysis accurately identified violating applets. We ended up finding that there are some rules that were determined to be violating based on the automated analysis that we would actually say are not violating. For example, in the rule, if new tweet by specific user, then add a row to a Google spreadsheet, the trigger, new tweet by specific user, could have the labels restricted online or public. The uncertainty between which of these two labels would actually be correct contributed to the rule being deemed violating. But from the title of P20's use of this rule, which was "Save Every Tweet by the US President," we know that the Twitter account referenced in this trigger is actually public, and that would be sufficient to determine that this rule is actually not violating. Additionally, although Google Spreadsheets can have a variety of sharing settings ranging from private to public, participant survey responses indicated that the Google Docs and other cloud storage files they use with IFT are almost always private, which would have also been sufficient to determine that this rule is not violating. So I guess that makes it extra non-violating. We also found that some rules deemed non-violating were actually potentially violating. For example, imagine a hypothetical rule with secrecy labels for the trigger and action that are both restricted online. This would be considered non-violating because the analysis doesn't distinguish between different restricted online groups. But there definitely are different restricted online groups. For example, if the trigger was related to Facebook and the action was related to a Google Sheet, then the audience of the trigger and action might actually be different. If the Google Sheet is shared with anyone who I'm not friends with on Facebook, then it would actually be appropriate to say that this rule is violating. But whether or not the analysis accurately identifies violating applets is only part of the picture. The end goal of the analysis is to accurately flag applets that are actually likely to lead to harms to users. That is, we wanted to really know whether all of the violating applets are harmful and whether any of the non-violating applets could be harmful. We found that no, not all violating applets are actually likely to lead to harm. For example, in the rule, if motion detected in front yard, then turn on security camera, this rule clearly contains an integrity violation. It allows anyone who gains access to my yard to control my security camera, which they could try to do maliciously, and they wouldn't otherwise be able to do that, to turn on my security camera. But that's the whole point of this rule, to start recording anytime people are in this physical space. So it really doesn't make sense to consider this rule harmful. There are also different impacts that an integrity violation might have depending on what the action is. Intuitively, it seems quite clear that the types of harm that could come from an adversary maliciously controlling a light bulb through a rule would be quite different than the types of harm that could come if an adversary could control my smart door lock or other home security devices. And these are also quite different from the types of harm that could come if an adversary can send me notifications or update a spreadsheet that I use with my rules. In all of these cases, there is a potential for harm. If the lights are turned off while I'm walking down the stairs, I could trip and hurt myself in the dark. Someone could gain unauthorized access to my home if the smart door lock is compromised. Or someone could cause me to be interrupted in an important meeting by spamming me with notifications through a rule. The automated analysis would consider rules with any of these types of actions equally violating if their secrecy and integrity labels contained a violating flow. But it doesn't really make sense to think of these as all being the same. Of these three types of actions, we determined that home security actions seem most likely to lead to significant harms due to integrity violations. And so overall, using this type of reasoning, we determined that only around 14% of users' rules were actually likely to lead to secrecy or integrity-related harms. This is significantly less than the 59% of rules initially deemed violating. But there are also many rules deemed non-violating that could be harmful in other ways. For example, in the rule, if Alice's presence is detected, then create a journal entry, this rule was correctly determined to not have a potential secrecy violation because the journal entry is private. But a rule like this could be used by the IFT user to monitor someone else. We discussed this as surveillance risks to incidental users. Another type of harm that wasn't previously considered exists in a rule like, if weather forecast calls for snow tomorrow, then send me an email. A person expecting to get an email about the weather forecast would likely believe whatever information they receive, even though they can't really be sure that the email was actually sent because of the rule, since email is pretty easily spoofable. So even though this rule wasn't violating, there might be some reasons to be concerned about the trustworthiness of information conveyed through this rule. P10 humorously pointed out the possible risk associated with a rule like this, saying, maybe someone could trick me into thinking that there was a snow day. The disappointment. In a very coarse-grained approximation, we determined that around 20% of rules could lead to surveillance risks to incidental users, and 25% might mislead the user about the trustworthiness of information they receive. Of these, some were initially deemed violating, and some were initially deemed safe. But the key point is that the analysis was not designed to identify this type of harm, or several other types of harm that we discuss in the paper. In this talk, I've shown how real user data can help us better understand whether IFT rules actually create secrecy or integrity vulnerabilities, and independently, whether those issues related to secrecy and integrity are likely to correspond with actual harmful outcomes. We found that the existing automated analysis is not always accurate. It sometimes mislabels violating applets as non-violating and vice versa. But more generally, we found that the harms that can arise from users' IFT rules do not always correspond to secrecy and integrity violations. There are legitimate, harmless reasons to use rules that technically have secrecy or integrity violations, and there are possible harms, such as surveillance risks to incidental users, that do not have secrecy or integrity violations. For more details and results, we hope you'll read our paper.